Clara Lewis had always been a light sleeper, but that morning was different. For the first time in weeks, she felt the kind of exhaustion that pulled her into deep rest. Her eyes were heavy even as she walked through the crowded terminal at JFK Airport, dragging her small blue suitcase behind her. She had spent the last 7 nights on duty as a travel nurse in New York, caring for patients in a busy hospital ward. Her shift had ended at dawn, and without going home, she had come straight to the airport for her flight to Los Angeles. Her ticket showed seat 8A, a window seat, the one she always preferred. She liked watching the world disappear under the clouds. As she boarded the plane, she smiled faintly at the flight attendant who greeted her and quietly slid into her seat. The hum of conversation, the shuffle of luggage, and the faint music coming from someone's headphones blended together, forming the soft chaos of an early morning flight. Clara buckled her seatbelt and leaned her head against the cold window. Her eyelids fluttered as she looked at the wing outside, gleaming in the morning sun. The sky looked peaceful, a light blue stretching endlessly. She closed her eyes before takeoff and barely noticed when the plane lifted off the ground. Around her, passengers settled into their routines. A young couple in 8B and 8C watched a movie, sharing earbuds. Across the aisle, an elderly woman was knitting, humming softly to herself. The flight attendants moved quietly down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. Everything felt calm and ordinary, just another flight crossing the country. For Clara, it was a moment of escape. The stress of the hospital, the late-night alarms, the endless stream of patients, it all faded as she drifted into sleep. Her mind floated somewhere between dreams and reality. She dreamed of her small apartment in Los Angeles, of the ocean breeze she missed so much. Time passed quietly. The plane glided smoothly through the clear sky, leaving behind the noise of cities and roads far below. The captain's voice came on once, welcoming passengers and announcing the flight time. His calm tone added to the comfort in the cabin. Most passengers had their headphones on or were lost in their thoughts. 2 hours into the flight, a light turbulence shook the plane. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and a few passengers looked up nervously. Clara stirred but didn't wake. She shifted slightly, pulling the small airline blanket closer to her shoulder. The movement was gentle, almost soothing, but inside the cabin something had subtly changed. A flight attendant, a young woman named Mia, walked briskly toward the front after speaking quietly with a man in row 23. Her face looked composed, but there was a trace of worry in her eyes. She knocked on the cockpit door, whispered something to the co-pilot, and disappeared behind the curtain. Most passengers didn't notice. A baby cried somewhere near the back. Someone laughed at a comedy scene on their tablet. But a few people sensed the change in atmosphere, the kind of quiet alertness that comes before an announcement. Clara slowly opened her eyes. She wasn't sure what had woken her. Maybe the turbulence or maybe the silence that followed it. She looked outside and saw clouds glowing golden under the sun. It was beautiful, almost unreal. She took a deep breath and stretched her neck slightly. Everything seemed fine. She was about to close her eyes again when the soft ding of the intercom echoed through the cabin. The captain's voice came over the speakers. At first it sounded calm and routine, just as it had earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." There was a pause, just a breath longer than normal. His tone shifted slightly, no longer casual but serious and steady. "If there is a doctor, nurse, or medical professional on board, please press your call button immediately." For a second, the words didn't register. Clara blinked, still half asleep, unsure if she had heard correctly. But when she looked around, she saw the faces of other passengers, startled, curious, worried. A few heads turned, searching for someone to respond. Her heart began to race. Years of training took over before her thoughts could catch up. She unbuckled her seatbelt quickly and pressed the call button above her head. The nearest flight attendant appeared almost instantly, relief flashing in her eyes when she saw Clara's raised hand. "I'm a nurse," Clara said, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you," the attendant said with a deep breath. "Please come with me. He's in the back." Clara grabbed her small crossbody bag where she kept her medical ID and hurried down the aisle. The curious eyes of passengers followed her. Some whispered quietly, others simply watched in silence, hoping everything would be fine. As she moved toward the rear of the plane, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. Her tiredness was gone, replaced by alert focus. The world around her narrowed to one thought: someone needed help. The back of the cabin was crowded. A man in his 50s lay slumped in his seat, his skin pale and his breathing uneven. His wife sat beside him, trembling, her hands gripping his arm. Two flight attendants stood nearby with the small medical kit open, unsure what to do next. Clara immediately took charge. She knelt beside the man and gently touched his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked softly. There was no response. She checked his pulse and then his breathing. Her voice stayed calm, though she could feel the tension around her, the quiet panic of strangers trapped in a metal cabin thousands of feet above the ground. She asked the attendants to bring the emergency oxygen tank and started checking his airway. "He's breathing, but it's shallow," she said quickly. "Do you have a blood pressure cuff or stethoscope?" One of them nodded and opened the kit wider. Inside was a small collection of medical tools, basic but useful. Clara worked efficiently, giving instructions, reassuring the man's wife, and keeping her own fear controlled. The training that had guided her through hospital emergencies now guided her in the sky. The passengers nearby watched in silence. Some prayed quietly, others simply held their breath. The sound of the engines felt louder than before, the hum almost matching the rhythm of Clara's heartbeat. After a few minutes, the captain's voice came again, more serious now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are aware of the medical situation on board. Please remain seated and allow space for our medical volunteer to work. Thank you for your cooperation." Clara barely noticed the announcement. Her attention was fixed on the man before her. His breathing steadied slightly after she adjusted the oxygen mask. The color began to return to his face, and his wife let out a shaky sigh of relief. Mia, the flight attendant, crouched beside Clara. "The captain wants to know if we should make an emergency landing," she whispered. Clara hesitated for a moment, checking the man's pulse again. "If his breathing stays stable, we might be okay until Denver," she said. "But stay ready, just in case." Mia nodded and hurried to the cockpit. Clara continued to monitor the man, keeping her voice soft and encouraging. She asked the attendants to bring some water and help him stay comfortable. Slowly, the tension in the cabin eased a little. When Clara finally sat back on her heels, she felt the weight of what had just happened. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the release of adrenaline. She looked around and realized that dozens of eyes were still watching her. Passengers who had seen her rush forward, not knowing what she would find. A small smile crossed her face when she saw the man's wife holding his hand tightly, whispering something only he could hear. The man's chest rose and fell with steadier rhythm now, a sign of hope in the middle of the clouds. Clara stayed near them for the rest of the flight, checking in every few minutes. The flight attendants brought her water and thanked her repeatedly, their gratitude shining through their tired smiles. The cabin slowly returned to a calm rhythm. The tension that had filled the air dissolved into quiet conversations and sighs of relief. When the captain made another announcement, his voice carried warmth this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, thanks to a passenger's quick response, our medical situation is under control. We'll continue to monitor it closely and land safely in Denver for further assistance." Clara felt a wave of quiet satisfaction. She didn't need applause or attention. Helping people was simply what she did. It was her purpose. As the plane continued its journey, she sat again by the window seat near the back, where the crew had offered her a place to rest. She looked out at the endless sky, its soft blue stretching into forever. The sunlight glimmered across the clouds, and for a moment she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Somewhere in the hum of the engines, in the steady rhythm of flight, Clara realized something. Even when she was exhausted, even when she just wanted to rest, her instinct to help would always wake her. It was who she was, a nurse, a healer, and a person who couldn't ignore a cry for help no matter where she was. As the passengers began to relax again, some of them came by to quietly thank her. One elderly man whispered, "You were an angel today." Clara smiled shyly, brushing away the praise. By the time the captain announced they were starting their descent toward Denver, the mood on the plane had completely changed. There was no longer fear, only relief and quiet gratitude. The man in distress was awake now, holding his wife's hand and looking at Clara with tearful eyes. He mouthed the words, "Thank you," and she simply nodded. When the plane began to descend through the clouds, Clara closed her eyes once more. She thought about how the morning had begun, with exhaustion and sighing. The moment the plane touched down in Denver, a wave of relief filled the cabin. The wheels met the runway with a soft thud, and the familiar sound of brakes easing the plane to a halt echoed through the space. Many passengers let out a collective sigh. Some even clapped quietly. It wasn't the usual applause for a smooth landing. It was gratitude, silent and deep. They had all felt the tension of those uncertain minutes in the air, and now they could finally breathe again. Clara sat near the rear, still keeping her eyes on the man she had helped. His name was David Miller, a 56-year-old businessman who had been on his way home after a week of travel. His wife Margaret kept holding his hand, her eyes filled with tears that were part fear, part thankfulness. Clara smiled softly at her and said, "He's going to be okay. You did the right thing by calling for help quickly." Margaret nodded, still trembling. "I don't know what would have happened if you weren't here," she whispered. Clara didn't know what to say. She simply gave her a reassuring smile. For her, it didn't matter who she helped. It was instinct, the same way she would have helped anyone in the hospital. But this time it felt different. They weren't on solid ground. They were in the sky, and there were no doctors or equipment, only her, a small medical kit, and hope. When the door finally opened, paramedics were waiting outside. The flight attendants quickly guided them to the back where David sat. They moved with practiced hands, checking his vitals, asking questions, and preparing to take him off the plane. Clara stepped back quietly, letting them do their job. One of the paramedics, a tall man with kind eyes, looked up at her and said, "You did great work here. You probably saved his life." Clara gave a humble nod. "I just did what I could," she said softly. The passengers watched as David was carefully moved onto a stretcher. His wife followed close behind, clutching his hand and whispering thanks to Clara again and again as she passed. Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion but managed to smile. "He's in good hands now," she said gently. After they left, the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for the next group of passengers. The flight was making an unscheduled stop, and everyone needed to wait while the plane was checked and refueled. The crew moved quickly, but before long, the captain himself stepped out from the cockpit. He was a tall man in his 50s with calm blue eyes and a tired smile. He walked straight to Clara and extended his hand. "Miss, I just wanted to thank you personally," he said. "What you did up there, it took courage and skill. Not many people would have stayed that calm." Clara shook his hand, feeling slightly embarrassed by the attention.
"Thank you, Captain, but really anyone in my place would have done the same," she replied. The captain smiled knowingly.
"Maybe," he said, "but not everyone does." After that, the crew insisted that she take one of the front seats to rest while they waited. They brought her water and a snack, and passengers who passed by on their way out stopped to thank her. Some smiled warmly. Others just nodded quietly, their eyes saying more than words ever could. When the cabin finally emptied, the plane felt strangely peaceful again. Clara sat by the window and stared outside at the airport lights flickering against the evening sky. Her body was tired, but her mind was still wide awake. She thought about the moment when the captain's announcement came, the confusion, the sudden rush of energy, the fear on the passengers' faces. It had felt like a dream, but every heartbeat, every second of it was real. She could still feel the pulse she had checked, the weight of the oxygen mask in her hands, and the relief when David had started breathing normally again. As she sat there, the flight attendant named Mia came and sat beside her for a moment. "You know," Mia said softly, "I've worked on flights for 8 years, and I've seen passengers panic over much smaller things. But you didn't panic at all." Clara smiled faintly. "I guess I'm used to emergencies," she said. "In hospitals, it happens all the time. But this," she paused, glancing out the window, "this felt different. There was nowhere else to go. Everyone was depending on each other." Mia nodded thoughtfully. "That's true. People forget that sometimes, even up here, we're all human. When things go wrong, kindness matters more than anything." Clara agreed. "Kindness saves people too," she said. When the new passengers began boarding for the continuation of the flight, the crew made sure Clara was comfortable. They even moved her back to her original seat in 8A near the window. The sun had already set and the horizon was painted in shades of gold and pink. As the engine started again, the familiar vibration of the plane comforted her. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and exhaled deeply. When the plane lifted off again, Clara looked out the window. The city lights below faded into a blanket of darkness dotted with stars. The world looked peaceful from above, quiet, endless, and beautiful. She thought about her life as a nurse. There were days when it felt thankless, days when she questioned if her efforts made any real difference. But moments like this reminded her that even one small action, one calm decision, could change the course of someone's life. A few hours passed in silence. Most passengers were asleep, and the cabin was dim except for the soft lights above each seat. Clara couldn't sleep yet. Her mind was replaying the events over and over. She remembered how quickly everything had happened, how everyone had looked at her when the announcement came. It was strange to think that she had gone from sleeping peacefully to saving a life, all within a few minutes. When the flight attendants came around again, Mia stopped by her seat and handed her a small folded note. "It's from the captain," she whispered with a smile. Clara opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, slightly slanted, and written in blue ink. It said, "Miss Lewis, what you did today reminded everyone on this plane what humanity truly means. In moments of fear, you brought calm. In chaos, you brought hope. On behalf of every soul on this flight, thank you. Captain Reynolds." Clara read the note twice, then folded it and kept it in her bag. She didn't realize until then that her eyes were misty. She looked outside again, watching the moon reflect off the clouds. Hours later, when the plane finally landed in Los Angeles, most passengers were still quiet, as if the entire experience had bonded them somehow. People smiled more, spoke softly, and moved with gentle patience. As they exited, several stopped to thank Clara again. She simply nodded, shy but warm, wishing them safe travels. Outside, the cool night air of Los Angeles touched her face as she stepped off the jet bridge. For the first time since morning, she felt the full weight of exhaustion, but along with it came a deep sense of peace. At the baggage claim, she sat on a bench waiting for her suitcase. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from the airline. They wanted to officially thank her for her assistance and offer her a free round-trip ticket as a gesture of appreciation. She smiled, touched but humble, replying with a short message. "Thank you, but helping was reward enough." Later that night, when she finally reached her apartment, she didn't turn on the lights right away. She just stood by the window, looking out at the city lights glittering below. The note from the captain rested on her kitchen counter. She picked it up again and read it once more. It made her realize something she had always known deep down, that no act of kindness, no matter how small or spontaneous, ever truly goes unnoticed. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The sound of distant traffic mixed with the soft whisper of the night breeze. It was quiet, the kind of quiet she used to crave. But tonight it felt meaningful. Somewhere a man she barely knew was alive and breathing, because she had chosen to wake up when she heard that desperate announcement. Days later, Clara received a letter. It was handwritten, the envelope simple but neat. When she opened it, her heart skipped. It was from Margaret and David Miller. "Dear Clara," it began, "we don't have words big enough to thank you. That day on the plane, you were our angel. David is recovering well and the doctors say he'll be fine. Every time we talk about that flight, we remember your calm voice, your steady hands, and your kindness. You didn't just save his life. You saved mine too, because I can't imagine this world without him. We will never forget you. With love and endless gratitude, Margaret and David." Clara read the letter slowly, her eyes softening. She placed it next to the captain's note and smiled. The two letters became her quiet treasures, reminders that compassion could travel farther than miles, and that courage could appear even when least expected. Weeks passed, and life returned to normal. She went back to work, to her patients, to the routine of long shifts and gentle care. But every time she looked out a hospital window and saw a plane crossing the sky, she thought of Flight 217, of the captain's trembling voice, of the passengers' anxious eyes, of the woman who had trusted her with her husband's life. And she thought of how in one unexpected moment, a simple nurse from Seat 8A had become a symbol of hope for everyone on board. That memory stayed with her, not as a story to tell, but as a quiet reminder of what truly mattered. Life was unpredictable. Emergencies didn't wait for the right time or place. But love, courage, and compassion could always rise above fear, even 30,000 feet in the air. As the months went by, Clara sometimes received messages from people who had been on that flight. Some sent photos, some just wrote short